So, so this wrongful conviction starts in New York City in 1910, around December 10th, at a boarding house at 51 3rd Street, where a young lady by the name of Miss Washock was staying. She was looking for her fortune in the big city, like many young people still do today, of course. And in order to do that, she did what many folks would have done at that time, and that is she put an ad in the newspaper. And as it turns out, she put an ad in a newspaper called the New York Journal, which you can see here. The New York Journal was distributed around New York City, and it had employment wanted kind of advertising. Miss Washock did get a response to her advertisement, but it was not what she expected. Instead, she got an obscene letter with a proposition that she was not interested in. And she, being a respectable lady, did not know what to do with this letter and how to respond to it, or what it, what the proper thing to do was. So she took it to the people at the boarding house, and they recommended to her that she take the letter to this gentleman, Anthony Comstock. Now, Comstock had established something called the Society for the Prevention of Vice many decades before this, so he was very famous by this time in New York. He had been responsible for the establishment of many laws against obscenity, and he saw this letter. He saw Miss Washock, and he said, "We're going to get this guy. We have the necessary tools to be able to do this." Now, as it turns out, when the letter was written, the letter writer had told Miss Washock that if she was interested in the indecent proposal, that she could put another ad in the New York Journal, and they could then meet based on that ad. And indeed, that's exactly what Comstock took advantage of. So what they did was Comstock looked at the letter and the postmark, realized it had been mailed from a post office, which at that time was at 4th Street and 23rd Avenue, or no, 4th Avenue and 23rd Street. 4th Avenue, I believe, is Park Avenue now, but don't quote me on that. I'm not an expert in Manhattan geography. But there was a post office there at that time, and so they arranged in the advertisement to say, well, I'm back, and you may meet me outside of the post office at 4th and 23rd on the 19th of December, 1910, at 1 p.m. And so that's exactly what they arranged. And so the post office, this isn't exactly the street scene, but it's pretty close to the street scene in question. This is a nearby street from that period, and Miss Washock stood on the street on the one side, and Comstock then was at a distance, sort of casing the place, looking at what was going on. They were there at the appointed time at 1 p.m., and they then just waited. And she waited for a while, for a good 15 minutes, and didn't have anybody approaching her. And then she realized she saw somebody across the street, and she was like, well, maybe this is the guy that who was trying to meet me. So she crossed the street to meet him, and that's where our individual that the story is about primarily comes into play. This guy is Oscar Krueger. This is from a contemporary picture or etching that occurred, that was in a newspaper, actually a Sheboygan newspaper is where I was able to find it. And this is what Krueger looked like. They described him as being Teutonic in character, which at the time there was a belief that people who were like heavy set, big boned, and that kind of thing were more prone to crime. And so seeing Krueger on the street, they decided that she decided that this might be indeed the letter writer. So she crosses the street, goes up to him, and she says, "Are you Ed?" Because the letter had been signed Ed. And he's like, "Yeah, I'm Ed." And she's like, "Oh, did you write the letter?" And he said, "No." He said, "I don't know what you're talking about." And she's then told him, "Well, then you're not the person I'm looking for." And he sort of hesitated at this point and then said, "Oh, yes, I did write the letter. I did write the letter." And got to talking. They talked back and forth. And eventually, after some kind of obtuse conversation that isn't well reported by either one of them, decided to meet later that day at another place. And indeed, Miss Washach showed up at that other place, but Krueger did not. However, Anthony Comstock had observed this whole thing, and then he tracked down Krueger separately. And he confronted Krueger and says, "I think you wrote this obscene letter." And Krueger proclaimed his innocence. He always did throughout this entire case. And he says, "I didn't write that letter. That's not. He has a wife. He has 2 kids. He worked as a laborer, kind of a painter, plasterer type person. Never had a criminal record or anything of that nature." And so he felt like Comstock and had accused him improperly. Comstock said, "Well, if that's the case, why don't you write Miss Washach's name on a piece of paper, and we'll compare the two." And indeed, Krueger did this. And when Comstock looked at the two writings, he said he felt they were written by the same person. And he took them to another handwriting expert. Comstock was not actually a handwriting expert, but he was like playing one on the streets of New York, right? But he did bring in somebody else. We don't know the name of the person. I could speculate, but I don't really know. And that person backed up Comstock's conclusion that Krueger had written the letter. On that basis, in January of 1911, Krueger was arraigned, and then he was tried in February before a jury trial. His defense attorney made a very critical mistake, at least as far as we're concerned, in terms of looking at forensic science errors, and that is he did not call a separate witness on behalf of Krueger to look at the handwriting comparison. And so Krueger was, in a sense, not really defended very well, at least when it came to the forensic evidence. So in the trial, first Ms. Washach came up. She says, "I got this letter." She recounted going up to Krueger, talking to him about it, what he said. Comstock said, "Yes, I saw the whole thing. That is the guy." This other handwriting expert testified. And Krueger got up on the stand on his own behalf and said, I just went along. I didn't know what this woman was saying or doing or what was going on. I was just she seemed like she was coming on to me. I really wasn't interested, and I just and that's proven by the fact that I did not show up at the second meeting. Nonetheless, the jury did not believe him. The jury convicted him in federal court because he was convicted under, I believe it was section 201, 210, something like that, of the federal penal code, which at that time and still today prohibits the use of U.S. mail for the delivery of obscene or inappropriate content. And he was convicted of that in federal court and sentenced to penitentiary actually in Atlanta. Very far away from New York, but it was the federal government. They could put him in the penitentiary where they pleased. He, of course, was incredibly upset by this. He wrote letters to the president and to the attorney general saying, "I'm innocent, you have to help me." They said, "We can't really help you unless you put in a form for consideration of for the fact that you might be innocent." And this was very important in this day and age. It still is true today. There was a concept about the finality of verdicts, and it was very, very well accepted at that time. The feeling being that convictions were almost always fair, they're almost always correct, and they couldn't retry every case because every criminal in prison thinks they're innocent and will claim so. And so it was very difficult. Still is, to get a habeas corpus petition saying, "Hey, I've got new evidence," or whatever it would be. And Krueger didn't really have new evidence. He didn't have anything that said that really exonerated him in a way that was different from what was looked at in the trial. And so an appeal really wasn't open to him. He really had to get some kind of executive clemency or pardon. He put in his form for that 2 times and was turned down fairly summarily, apparently 2 times. The third time he put in the paper, a gentleman by the name of Daniel Walton, who was an assistant U.S. attorney in New York, picked it up and reviewed the case and came to the conclusion that there might be something to Krueger's story, that Krueger might have actually been innocent. And so Walton reviewed it. He brought in a guy named Kinsley. What was his? William Kinsley. William Kinsley was a very well-known handwriting expert. In fact, from Krueger's perspective, was the ideal person to review this. Kinsley had published, he was very, very well-known, and he had published actually a book called Tales Told by Handwriting, a little book, which was kind of his history of cases that he had worked on in the Saturday Evening Post in about 10 years before all this. And the Saturday Evening Post, for those of you who don't know, was a very, very important publication during that time. It was definitely considered like if you were published in the Saturday Evening Post, that was like being on national TV, basically. And so that was Kinsley was impressive. He was we don't know all the ways in which he operated. He talked a little bit about how to do handwriting and how it should be performed, but he didn't really do it in the way that we would understand it today, because those standards had not yet been established. And those standards today, as we understand them, and the way in which the forensic professions are organized, really do follow something that's a little bit more formalized today than it was at that time. I'm showing you here, this is actually from a paper in 1936 by a man by the name of William Osborne, who really revolutionized the practice of handwriting examination, and whose, I think, great-great-grandson still is a practicing document examiner today. And this shows you kind of the variation of a particular word, that. If you look at the T's here, sometimes the up and down part of the T is closed, sometimes it's open, sometimes the cross is up, sometimes it's down, sometimes it doesn't even hit the T, the rest of the letter. All of these things are particular patterns that are accepted as ways of trying to individualize handwriting to various degrees of confidence today. Kinsley must have done something similar to this at the time to look at Krueger's handwriting, but we really don't know. It's clear that Comstock did not follow this type of methodology. And it's pretty clear that almost every other handwriting examiner, other than Kinsley at that time, did not follow that kind of a methodology. When Kinsley looked at the letter and he looked at reference writing from Krueger, he said, well, I can see why somebody who might not be that well trained in the field would conclude that Krueger was the letter writer, but it's very clear that he was not, and he backed that up to the point where the assistant U.S. attorney, this fellow by the name of Daniel Walton, agreed with him and said, "I believe you. I think this is good." Kinsley was very convincing, and Walton recommended that Krueger be exonerated. Now, the interesting thing here is, of course, that Comstock didn't agree, and neither did Miss Washock, the victim. They both felt throughout this process that Krueger had been guilty, that he got what he deserved, and they did not care whether Kinsley or anyone else said something about the handwriting. It was not considered definitive to them that it was exculpatory for Oscar Krueger. Nonetheless, what then happened was that then President William Howard Taft, this gentleman, did issue a pardon for Oscar Krueger, and he was thereby released, and his record was expunged, and he goes down in history as a kind of a landmark in wrongful convictions. There weren't that many exonerations in 1910, 1911, when he finally got his pardon, and it was unusual. He eventually, his story was told in the papers at the time, and it was then also told by Edward Burchard in a book called Actual Innocence in the 1930s, which for the first time made the case that wrongful convictions were important, that there were enough of them that there should be more openness. There should be more procedures to appeal wrongful convictions. And Borchardt actually went one step further and said that they should be compensated. That the wrongfully convicted should be compensated, which is way ahead of his time. There were some defendants who had been compensated around this time, but very, very few in the early part of the 20th century ever saw that. And in fact, that was true for Krueger as well. Although he was released and pardoned, he was not compensated for his wrongful conviction. And we don't know anything more that happened to Mr. Krueger, which is kind of sad. We do wonder kind of what might have occurred in the rest of his life, or what else happened with his family and and that kind of thing. But he was wrongfully convicted and exonerated, and so we have that from him. I hope that was enjoyable and educational, and thank you for listening.